Hi, good afternoon. Thank you for joining our presentation today. Does it look like we have enough attendees yet?
77.
77, wonderful. Well, we want to thank everyone for joining our presentation this afternoon. It's really sort of a merger of two previous presentations. So we're calling this the District Facilities Plan Overview and how that KFIX gets intertwined with that process. If you weren't aware, the facilities branch is part of Kentucky Department of Education's Office of Finance and Operations, the district facilities support, and then ultimately the district facilities branch. Next slide, please. So first, we need the introductions of who we are. Beginning first, next, please. Head of the Kentucky Department of Education is Commissioner Robbie Fletcher. Next slide, please. Associate Commissioner Mac Ross with the Division of District Support, Jay Ritter. Next slide. Our branch manager is Greg Dunbar, who is also present for the presentation. The rest of the staff includes Gary Least, Marcus Hyland, myself. Next slide. Teresa Hester, John Gilbert. Next slide, please. And Tanisha Keene is our resource management analyst. Next slide. Though not directly part of the facilities branch, part of the district support is Oksana. Sorry, Oksana. Pineda. Thank you. Next slide, please. So before we get into the presentation, I wanted to make sure you were aware on our website, we have a district facilities training posting. So if you go to the facilities website highlighted in the green box on the left-hand side of the screen, there will be a menu for district facilities branch live training and events. So in the coming days, this event will also be posted at that location. Next slide, please. Also at our website is information that is relevant to the KFIX process. And it is available from the same left side menu, just further down. Next slide, please. Right. So for those who are new to the process, we're going to begin with what is a district facilities plan, and then we'll ask, well, why do we do district facilities plan, which is to segue also into why we do the KFIX. These are a result of statutes and regulations, and then how these two processes come together specifically are in the form of the assessments, the DFP orientation, and then ultimately how information is shared on the DFP itself. Next slide, please. All right, so first question, what is a district facilities plan? Next slide. Well, the planning manual defines the district facilities plan as a comprehensive review and evaluation of the school district's facilities that is prepared every 4 years. This evaluation is undertaken by a local planning committee with the assistance of the district, administrative staff, architects, engineers, KDE, and other consultants. The district facility plan and its preparation are governed by 702 KAR 4180 and is the determinant of the district needs calculation and the trigger for expending restricted construction funds. Next slide. Now, why do we do a DFP? Well, there's constitutional, statutory, regulatory requirements for this. And as the last slide said, it's the determinant of the district needs. So we highlighted that in yellow because that's what we use this information for. Next slide. So beginning first with the Constitution, we just put it up for the reference. It's just the sections 183, 84, 85, and 86. where it requires that KDE have a proficient system for common schools throughout the state. Next slide. The statutes that are applicable really begin with capital outlay, FSPK funds, SFCC funds, and the specific statutes are referenced in the slide. Next slide. The way KDE administers these regulations or statutes is through 702 KAR 4180, which is commonly referred to as the Kentucky School Facilities Planning Manual. So it's incorporated by reference, but most people still refer to this as the planning manual. And I guess it's important to also point out that this document is also available on the website that we showed the link to earlier. Next slide, please. Why do we do KFIX? Next slide, please. So KFIX is an acronym. It's the Kentucky Facilities Inventory Classification System, or KFIX for short. It really began back in 2011, 2012. For those who've been around that long, I think most people remember that as the Parsons Report. But essentially what it was a standardized process for evaluating school buildings, the quality and the condition of those buildings across the state. Well, that's been carried through and still relevant today. But technically speaking, KFIX is separate from the DFP process. However, there are similarities, and this is really what the purpose of this meeting is where do these two processes overlap? Our goal is to try to reduce these redundancies so that some of these processes are only done once rather than both times. Next slide, please. Before I go any further, I want to also encourage, if there's questions along the way, please feel free to type them in the chat, and Tanisha will let us know as they come in. Tanisha, have we had any yet?
We have not.
Okay. Well, hopefully everyone can hear me well enough. All right, so the rest of the presentation is going to be centered on the DFP process and how the KFIX information is integrated into it. So there is some language that's the same in both, for example, assessments. And then the assessments for the two processes are culminated in the DFP orientation process, as well as the DFP itself. So those are the three topics of common paths. Next slide, please. So in DFP requirements, there is architect and engineer building assessment requirement. We put on the slide that it's specifically from section 102 in the planning manual. Among the things that are listed in the planning manual is the requirement for the architect and engineer to perform a building condition evaluation, a building use evaluation, and an inventory, or to make it a little simpler, the spaces themselves, along with the floor plan, which is the building drawings, the new construction cost pricing, and the renovation construction cost pricing. But the caveat being that new construction pricing is actually published annually by KDE. Next slide, please. The DFP building condition evaluation. The physical condition assessment, well, it should be informed by the information that's combined, that's also presented in the KFIX software, because the building condition itself should be the same, with a uniform analysis and the construction and renovation dates information being shared. So in the software program, if your building is 100,000 square feet, comes into the DFP process, it should also be 100,000 square feet. If it said that the building was constructed in 2000 in KFIX, then the building should be constructed in 2000 on your DFP. Next slide, please. The building use evaluation and inventory. Well, that old Excel file that we used to use in the DFP process is basically a one-for-one with KFIX. So we're encouraging that rather than submitting an old Excel spreadsheet, that you would then just simply say in an email that the building drawings that are in KFIX are current. You can use those. The building or the space inventory that's in the KFIX software is also current and correct. And then this would eliminate the requirement to turn around and do it again when you submit this information for your DFP. Looks like we may have a comment. No, no comments? Okay. Next slide, please. So the new construction pricing, as I alluded to a moment ago, the KDE replacement costs are what is used on the DFP itself. And it is also the same unit cost that is applied in the asset planner process for KFIX. So there's a commonality there that the unit costs are being published by KDE. They're not actually derived by the consultant, which is different than the renovation costs. So in KFIX, the renovation costs are based off of national averages, and the insurance replacement cost, excuse me. But when it comes to the DFP, that cost is explicitly prepared by the architect and engineer as part of their assessments. When these two assessments are not one for one, in the DFP process, the consultant would then advise KDE in writing of what the assessment is and how they arrived at those numbers. Next slide, please. The first time that this kind of culminates in the DFP process will be in the Part 2 orientation, where KDE will take some of the information that's prepared by the design consultant and put it into some of the slides. So what happens is you'll get an overview of the current building capacities, which is your space planner in your areas. And that will then become a line item in your Part 2 presentation of your current DFP, along with any of the projects that have been undertaken that have affected those projects. So once again, your school center information should be the same between both the information in KFIX as well as the information on the DFP, unless you're going to change the building itself, do an addition, or if you're going to vacate the building or repurpose it, things like that. Okay, next slide, please. Another area of common information is the reporting of spaces for purposes of capacity. In the inventory of spaces for KFIX, you'll just report standard classrooms and then the area for that space. But when it comes into the planning process, the capacity is dependent on the square footage, which will dictate the number of students for that standard classroom spaces. What's important to note is that this only applies to your standard classrooms. It does not apply to other areas such as special education rooms, music rooms, art rooms, computer labs, those types of spaces. But it's also important to note that elementary school classrooms have a different calculation because the students are anticipated to be in a space all day long. We have a question, it looks like. Give me a second here. And then the middle school and high school classrooms, which is the next slide, would be a different formula because 25% of the time will be elsewhere in the building. So we have a question?
Yes. It is from an anonymous, and it says, you mentioned space inventory and building drawings as a part of the building evaluation assessment. Since spatial deficiency costs are a part of the building evaluation assessment LPC presentation, can you clarify how KFIX should incorporate model program deficiency assessment, if at all? Or is that model assessment totally separate from KFIX?
It's a great question. So explicitly, K-Fix does not denote deficiencies in that form. That's part of the planning process. So this is one of the major differences between the two systems of information. K-Fix will only identify the spaces that have currently occupied the building. For example, if a classroom is 750 square feet instead of the standard 800 square feet, it's still compliant, and it's going to rank it. It's a Kentucky school suitability score. But that's all it does. It doesn't know if you have enough classrooms, or if you have too many, or if you've forgotten to record some of your program spaces. It doesn't do any of those things. That process occurs in planning. And that's where you will identify the spatial deficiencies in comparison to model program. And we'll talk about it a bit later, where, for example, if you have a space that you're using as a classroom, and let's say it's 500 square feet, well, that wouldn't meet the threshold for a minimal classroom, so it would be spatially deficient. But again, that process would be identified in planning, not in KFIX. Are there other questions?
Yeah, that's good. Thank you.
All right, next slide, please. Well, as I indicated in the previous slide, middle school and high schools, there's an additional factor that gets applied. And this is specifically because the students are elsewhere in the building 25% of the time. So, excuse me. Next slide, please. The way that this gets manifested first in the orientation process is when KDE prepares the slide, such as the example shown. There will be a column called capacity, and we will identify that the source of this is from KFIX data. This particular example was chosen because if during the process where we're building your orientation, we have not yet received the inventory information, or it's not been updated, we can proceed, but we're going to put a caveat on it, letting the district know that when this is presented that it's old data. So in this case, what you see is a 2019 reference, just because it's an older source of data, as opposed to, next slide, please. Yeah, I'm sorry. Additional information?
Yeah, go ahead to that slide real quick. To kind of answer that question a little bit further that was asked a moment ago, in a part 2 presentation, you will get this every time. And if all the KFIX information is updated in Space Planner, we can do the analysis where you won't see that yellow in capacity for KFIX that would be in the white. We would expect that to be updated and part of your DFP process. So getting that information in as an existing condition, we do some level of analysis on our end. So that should help expedite, I hope, connect a dot, if you will, as a design professional or a facility director, that when you're drafting your DFP, at the very top we have school centers, and the capacity component of that could come from this slide that's in your part 2. It's there and practically done for you on the front end as your LTC gets this information. And if you disagree with that, it's a perfect time to let us know, because we're not perfect. And if something needs to be adjusted, let us know, and we'll be happy to take a second look at it.
Next time. And that's a perfect segue, because I'm going to show you that information. So the way it is manifested is we'll get if KDE is directed to use the inventory, the space inventory, as we often refer to it, that comes out of KFIX, we'll export that data out, becomes frozen in time, if you will. And then we'll do the calculations that we showed in the previous slides. And it'll culminate in a calculated capacity, which is circled in the example on the bottom right-hand corner of the slide. Next slide, please. So that when you're doing these comparisons, as John was indicating, by the time we get the draft, we'll have already had the dialogue with the consultant about the differences between what was received at the time the slides were made versus at the time we received the draft DFP. Well, there's a number of other things that are reviewed at that point between the consultant and the evaluation of the existing conditions versus what's going to manifest in the draft DFP, which is, I think, part of what the question was earlier. Well, what if there's differences? What if there are spatial deficiencies? What if there are some program spaces that don't exist? What if you want to do an addition and that means that part of the existing spaces are going to be renovated and fit up to become something different? Well, these are all part of the assessment process that happens in planning that do not happen in KFIX. So I hope that ties back to the earlier question to explain some of the differences. They are not one for one. And just to kind of reiterate, the purpose of KFIX is to document your existing condition and its age and deterioration, as you know, things of that nature, and how you're using it. Purpose for planning is going to be for the changes to those spaces, that the overall cost changes to the building as well. Again, that's one of the common parts. So you will have the model program comparisons. You'll have your building physical assessments, which is the physical condition of that building. And then it's going to also add in planning that what is your short-term and long-term plan of organization, which has the potential to be different than your current condition. So there's one more the sort of differences between KFIX versus the planning process. Next slide, please. All right, well, the first part of your DFP, John alluded to it a little while ago, is that the date of your last DFP is going to be the very first thing you see in the header. And then it's going to be followed by your current and your proposed plans of organization. Your school centers themselves, what are their classifications? The status of the school, is it a permanent school center? Is it a transitional? What are the grades that these school centers serve? What's the enrollment to capacity, which is what we just specifically talked about. And then, is this information consistent with the information that's reported for the current school centers in the KFIX report? Well, an example of that is, next slide, please. So this is an example of a very recent DFP with the information shown as indicated previously. But I wanted to add, we're now adding an additional column. That column is the school classification. It's not new. It's been around for, well, a couple of decades or so, but it hasn't been evident on the DFP. One of the reasons why it's been added is because this information is contained in the ranked report that comes from KFIX. I've also added to the right, under the capacities, which again comes from the inventory of spaces in the floor plans that are reported in KFIX. I wanted to note that in this case, as John was alluding to earlier, now it shows 550. The reason is because we subsequently received an inventory of spaces and it resulted in a change from the 2019 information. So this is the time where we would have seen these differences between the information processed at the time of the Part 2 orientation and the time we actually are reviewing the DFP itself. So most of the time it has already, we have already received the inventories and the floor plans, but not 100% of the time. Next slide, please. So you might not be familiar with the ranked report. So this is an example, again, of Powell County. Again, circled in red is that column for the school classification. And the excerpt right below that is what are those school classifications? Because I realize some people in the audience may not know what those things are. Okay. So this is the slide we just left on. Apologize for the communication breakdown there. So this ranked report contains a number of critical things that gets communicated also on the DFP itself. And I'll talk more about how these two things are getting one for one in a few moments. Next slide, please. So in the DFP, you have priority 1 and priority 2 projects. Now, the purpose of this presentation is not to really get into the specifics of the planning manual types, but the point I was wanting to point out here specifically is the renovations component, which you see in 1C and next slide, please, and 2C. So as opposed to new construction, but K-Fix doesn't have new construction, so I didn't want to dwell on that. Next slide, please. So, but the planning manual specifically defines renovation projects by its building systems. I know a number of people have seen that we've shifted to marrying up the definition for building systems, and I'll show that here in a minute, where it is the individual components of a building, including the site work, foundation, exterior walls, roofing, doors, etc., as you see on the screen. This is a much narrower list than what is in K-Fix. The point is we don't need to bring over 45, 55, however many line items out of K-Fix. We can collapse it down and we can make it into a simpler narrative. Next slide, please. Well, the way that looks is in this example on this slide, where highlighted in yellow are sort of those bullet points, if you will. Site work provide a narrative. Your building hardware provides your narrative. So it's not a one-for-one with the breakdown in K-Fix. It's at best a summary, if you will. But the key takeaway between the narratives is that they're similar and that you can draw a path, but the construction costs are the biggest difference. K-Fix is only going to have a number specifically for existing systems in place. It doesn't have that. Like if your building's not suppressed, you won't see a line item in K-Fix for that, but you would definitely include it in your narrative here. You would also include, back to the question earlier, if you had spatial deficiencies, for example, in this bottom half of this slide, you would see renovations to existing, I believe that's in 1.3. If you had new spaces that you were going to build, like a media center, you would list that line item as new construction. But if you were going to renovate the old media center to be something different, that would be a fit up of the existing programs under the 1.3. Next slide, please. That specifically looks like this example. Again, we're going to use the Powell County recent DFP, where you see the date of construction, the square footage of the building, you see the construction cost, and then the narrative. And then to kind of draw those two things together, next slide, please. I have back to the earlier slide, the image from the ranked report, and I'm trying to show the parallels between this information, raw data. So you have your buildings, your school building itself, the up in the beginning portion of the DFP will have been, as we discussed earlier, the school classification. Your dates of construction, your square footage, your cost of construction will be where we see the difference in most cases. In this particular case, the architect submitted an explanation as to what the difference was between the information reported monthly in the ranked report versus the version that we received in the DFP. And this is perfectly acceptable. There's nothing wrong with that, but when they're different, you need to explain those differences along when you submitted your draft. Next slide, please. Additional changes would be elsewhere in the DFP. The question earlier was about model program comparisons. Well, if the school building doesn't have, say, an auditorium, K-Fix would not know that. It's not going to score a space that's not reported. But in this particular example, the high school doesn't have an auditorium, so you literally show a new space to be constructed using the published KDE insurance replacement costs. Next slide, please. Similarly, but information about other school assets, such as the central board office, the bus garage, your central storage buildings, those assets are also reported in K-Fix, but they are not reported in the ranked report. Once again, those are only school buildings, not the other school facilities. But when it comes to the district facilities plan, we still have to get the information about the buildings from somewhere. So we continue to direct you to put your asset information in the asset planner software so that we can carry forward the basic information, construction dates, square footage. The construction cost number is still going to pretty much come from the AE consultants, but it would still appear much as the school centers would as well. We have a question?
We do. With the major renovation description, how should we include new systems to building description? If we provide an opinion of probable cost to KDE, are there cost limitations for adding systems to a facility?
It's a great question. Yes, there are differences. So one of the things K-Fix does as existing systems is it has no concept of planning. So it doesn't know, for example, the requirement for 80% to ratio of new construction costs. So when you see a K-Fix number, back to that ranked report image, it is the replacement cost of the whole. One of those columns is square foot to square foot. K-Fix also doesn't have the requirement that planning has for the number of students served. Well, these are pretty major qualifiers when it comes to renovation needs, because just because you own a building doesn't mean you can show its full costs. Let me reiterate those two criteria. Then I'll talk about more in a moment. First, the building has to have been related to the number of students served. So if you say you want to renovate it as if it's got 700 students, but you only have 400, we're going to review it at 400. That's going to be a limitation. If the cost of construction, if the cost of renovation is in excess of 80% of the replacement cost for a new building, then you're going to have to move the additional cost down to priority 5 or potentially pursue a KBE waiver to that requirement. Hopefully I've answered that particular question. And I'll talk a little bit further about it in a couple more slides. Were there other questions too? Great. Next slide, please. The last thing, I kind of alluded to it a minute ago. In the district facility plan, we also have discretionary projects, which are priority 5. The key thing that I wanted to tie back to K-Fix is the thing about K-Fix is even if you have spatial deficiencies that have been identified in your DFP evaluation, but let's say you wanted to go ahead and add something more to it, or have mixed use in it, Well, it may be that the building becomes too big. And it's not that you can't include those program spaces or maybe even new construction. It might be that they have to be shown in priority 5. So the criteria for priority 5 is the 4 bullet points listed, which are building additions that are not justified or exceed allowable areas by comparison to the model program. It is extracurricular facilities with a caveat, which I didn't show, House Bill 678, but the majority of the districts, you're able to show those in other priorities. You have buildings which are too new or too recently renovated to qualify for major renovations. This is what I was going to refer to a moment ago. In order to qualify for renovation needs, the pieces and parts of the building had to be 30 years old, with the exception of roofing and HVAC is 15 years. Or if you have life safety building code compliance problems, or any American with disability deficiencies. These are all exclusions to the 30-year requirement, which could be listed up in priorities 1 or 2. And then the 1530 could apply to all assets, including 3 and 4, priorities 3 and 4. Next slide. Oh, wait, I have a slide question.
We do.
Yes, ma'am.
How should we amend the K-Fix replacement cost to reflect a more realistic opinion of probable cost? Example, if a roof replacement cost is generic per square feet, should we advise on an accurate cost for replacing the metal roof when the reported replacement cost is too low?
Yeah, it's a good question. So K-Fix is based off of an ASTM standard. So the concept is not that you're reporting your unique individual existing conditions as far as reporting costs. And that's the same thing that we do when we do our annual replacement costs. It's impossible for us to come up with every possible scenario of every finish out there. So it's not the high, it's not the low, it's an average. When you get to your planning process, this is the collision of your existing conditions and costs versus that 80% threshold that we were talking about earlier. So if you have a metal roof and it's time to replace it, it's going to cost you, let's say, $2.5 million, but the K-Fix line item is, let's say, $1.2 million. That's fine. Nobody's going to dispute or refute that. The only problem would be is if the sum of your reported renovation needs are going to exceed 80%, and let me say that a little differently, that's the sum of needs across all priorities. So if you have a building that has needs in priority 1, priority 2, and priority 3, it's the sum of all of those. So if the sum of those exceeds 80%, then you're going to draw attention to what those breakdowns are. But if it's just the example that was given where the particular roof is going to cost more than the particular line item that's in asset planner, that's fine. Again, nobody's gonna flag that. Now, I'm sure that if I saw somebody had just roofing listed only, and it said $10 million, you're going to draw my attention because, we don't have a $10 million roof anywhere in the state, but it's not that I'm aware of. The point really is that we aren't looking at the numbers at that level other than the sum of the reported costs. Now, I will say, if your ranked report says that the sum of the renovation needs that are eligible, let's say $7 million, but you have $28 million on the DFP for the same needs, you're going to draw attention. And the reason is, once again, there are 2 reports that are provided. So if the school district has reported vis-a-vis asset planner ranked report that our needs are X needs with X dollars, but then you turn around and show something drastically different on the DFP, not only does that draw attention to the staff at KDE, but it often draws attention external to KDE too, because this is all public information, right? So that's back to the statement, there should be a correlation between the basic information in the asset planner to what gets reported in DFP planning. They don't have to be one for one. You can have differences in quantitative numbers, but if they're wildly off, there's a decent chance, and you can't explain it, right? So for example, the question earlier, if you're going to do a cafeteria addition, and then you're going to repurpose the current cafeteria, that information is not showing up in KFIX. So you're talking about right off the bat, probably a couple $1 million difference. Well, that's justifiable. And, you know, again, nobody's going to probably argue that.
And we would expect a cost opinion from your design professional on renovating that area because you're just not going to find it in KFIX.
Correct.
And that should be required information attached to a draft DFP that comes to us. Because
Yep.
if we don't get that information, then we look at the 80% threshold and we look at the sum of the total for each building. And if the totals are way off, then we ask the questions. They don't have to be perfect. They just need to be in the ballpark. They can be over 80%. And if you're asking for 5 million for everything and it's 2 million on one, then you know, we're going to be asking the questions if we don't have the backup.
All right, next slide, please. Oh, wait, we have another question? Sure, go ahead.
Is the 30-year qualification exclusive to the building section as a whole or per element system?
Well, it's both, actually. So we'll continue with the roof example that was given a moment ago. So let's say the building is 60 years old, but the roof itself, since roofs have a 15-year example, we're going to say the roof is 20 years old. Well, nobody would question it, right? So you could show that all day long. But if you were wanting to replace the roof sooner, let's say 12 years, well, that would be flagged because it doesn't meet that criteria. Similarly for 30 years. So if someone says we want to replace our plumbing fixtures because they're 18 years old and I can get more efficient plumbing fixtures, you can't show that because they're not 30 years old yet. If you were making the case that, well, we're interested in doing, say, a guaranteed energy savings project, you need to understand that that's not one of the criteria in planning because that type of a delivery is exclusive of these requirements, right? They're guaranteed by the energy savings. So it doesn't link back to the restrictions that are applied in planning. So, what was there any other questions that were asked? Okay. But in, you know, trying to kind of link this back together between where these two reporting mechanisms have common ground. Well, they are both required. They are not one for one with each other. But when you're doing planning, you definitely need to be aware of what the information about those same assets is being reported in the current conditions. And then once it does manifest as a side, you know, continuation of the planning process, these things don't come in as a wish list. Please don't submit drafts before they've been submitted to the local planning committee and approved. It's expected that when they're submitted to KDE that they're already complete, they've been reviewed, that they're out compliant. So the 15, 30 years, all of these, the cost thresholds, the 80%, these are all things that have already been fleshed out before they're submitted to KDE for review. And then once again, to kind of wrap that up, both processes are required. They're not required by KDE. They're required by statutes. So it's just our regulations are reinforcing those statutes. Next slide. All right. Well, if I haven't given enough time for questions, let me at least ask for all questions at this time.
We're out. We'll just wait 5 more minutes to see if any come through.
Okay. All right. Well, in the meantime, for those of you who have not met or discussed things with Miss Tanisha Keene, she is commonly referred to as our fact pack guru. Her information is on this slide again, because she very frequently helps troubleshoot. She helps all sorts of technical questions. And if along the way you need some help with fact pack, please reach out to her. And then if you have other questions, please reach out to your project manager. And if that individual is not available, reach out to one of the other ones, because we're all here to help. Any questions? No? All right, well, we'll stay online for just a couple more moments in case somebody else has any questions. All right, well, Tanisha, one last time, any last questions?
When will K-Fix link directly to the DFP?
Not the question, when will K-Fix link to the DFP? That's not planned to happen in any foreseeable future. Primarily because they have different requirements. A great example of a difference between in planning, need comes off when a capital construction project is initiated. Well, K-Fix doesn't get updated when a project is initiated. It gets updated after a project is complete. So at the end of your capital construction project, you would go and you would update the conditioned portions of the building and or their spaces that were added or renovated. So there's a fundamental difference between these two scenarios that, frankly, we don't have a way to reconcile that. But there are similar things like that that I think will prevent these two things from marrying up, at least again, until the foreseeable future. But that's a great question. Anyone else?
Couple more. Discuss premature failure of roof or other element ahead of the timeline.
Sure. So a premature failure is essentially what happens. We'll go back to that roof scenario that was asked earlier. So if your roof has failed before that 15 years has run its course, let's say in year 10, well, you wouldn't be able to spend restricted funds to replace that. That's the premature, right? So effectively, what you would have to do is go through a waiver process to get it to be added to your DFP. But that's essentially you have to seek permission from KBE to allow something that otherwise would not be permitted to be shown as a need for the purposes of using a restricted fund source. Now, if that failed prematurely and you're using cash general funds, we really don't have much to talk about.
And on the flip side of that question with K-Fix, and you're talking about premature conditions in reporting, because that's, factored into how you're reporting your needs that inevitably inform your DFP. If you've got something that say is 50 years, its repeat interval, or 35 or whatever, you need to get in contact with your project manager as to the situation and the circumstances in that reporting. We certainly don't want to see things that are 2 years old all of a sudden show that premature. While we can't all perfectly align the stars in all of our systems and everything, the idea of 15 and 30 years in terms of how that relates to facility planning and access to funds, we try to translate that in terms of the evaluative process of K-Fix. When you're thinking about premature, thinking about it, does it qualify getting past that 15 and 30 years, but yet it's prematurely failing because it's a 45, I don't know, brick in there, I think like 45 or 50 years. But let's say you have some serious issues and the ties aren't working, there's lots of cracking, and you really want to put that in there to not meet that repeat interval. Just get with your project manager, make sure it's well documented, and we can walk you through any of those kind of considerations moving forward from a KFIX standpoint.
And to build on John's response, in KFIX, these are system-wide. So as an illustration for brick, let's say you had one facade on one portion of the wall, it may fall more into a maintenance scenario. It might be an expensive one
Sure.
nonetheless. But the mechanism in Asset Planner to do that is you copy the element. You have a second entry for that element item, and then you would indicate that it is a repair as opposed to a replace. So the software does have a mechanism to record such things. We aren't interested, nor do we track or use restricted funds for repair and maintenance. Sometimes use the analogy of, you don't take a car to replace your tires, at least not typically, oil changes or wiper blades, that kind of thing, right? It's expected that you're going to do the maintenance on your own. All right, you had other questions?
One more. Just to clarify, DFP should come from the design professionals, architects and engineers, and not from KFIX database.
All right, so let me break that down a little narrower. Renovation costs come from the AE. It should be informed by, and it should at least be respective of the information that is also reported in KFIX, which does not come from the AE. So when those two things are out of alignment on the DFP, it becomes sort of. But it is entirely possible for you to use one for one the costs. In fact, we see a fair amount of that, but we see, and rightfully so, differences where they are not the same. Okay, other questions?
That's it.
Wow. Well, we certainly appreciate everyone's time. The questions were great, very good questions. If you have other questions that might be coming to your mind, please reach out to any one of us, send us an email. We'll try to answer that independently. Look for this information to be posted on KDE's website at the link we talked about on the front end. And we hope you have a great day. Thank you.